A well-regulated militia be necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Thanks again for tuning in to another edition of Bearing Arms Cam and Company. Oh, I am so glad fall is finally here in Farmville, Virginia. Yeah, it's a high of something like 63 degrees. It was 90-something last week. I love it. I'm breaking out the flannel. In Ohio yesterday, Governor Mike DeWine broke out a 17-point public safety plan. Many items I think folks are not going to have a problem with at all. There are a couple of things that I think are probably raising some concerns for gun owners. And in just a moment, we're going to speak with Sean Maloney from Buckeye Firearms Association, who's actually been involved in a lot of these discussions about what this language is going to look like. And Sean's got some really, really valuable insight. We'll also talk about a new lawsuit that is seeking to block Oklahoma's constitutional carry law that is slated to go into effect on November the 1st, in just a few weeks. And we have our armed citizen story. We have our good deed of the day. We have a couple of more good ideas, by the way, for what to call this segment about the criminal justice system and the continued failures and the repeat offenders that we see time and time again. But let's get started with our conversation with Sean Maloney from Buckeye Firearms Association, delving into the nitty-gritty details. And it's interesting, I was watching this press conference yesterday, and one of the reporters asked Governor Mike DeWine, this seems really complicated. This seems like there are a lot of moving parts to this. This doesn't seem like it's just, ban all guns or require all background checks. That's good. Actually, I think that's good because simplistic solutions are often soundbite solutions. They're not real solutions at all. They allow politicians to say, look, I'm doing something. I'm making a law. It doesn't matter how good or bad this is. Now, I've got some legit concerns with some of what Governor Mike DeWine and Lieutenant Governor John Husted proposed yesterday. But I got to tell you, and I wrote about this at Bearing Arms, I appreciate the thoughtful approach that they have brought to this. And I also think that they are approaching this from a completely different angle than what we're seeing from gun control advocates who don't care about the constitutionality of their proposals. Really, they don't seem to care much about the effectiveness or the enforceability of their proposals. It's all about getting those gun control laws on the books. What we heard yesterday from Governor Mike DeWine and from the Lieutenant Governor and from those who were assembled there, I think represents an approach that really does seek to put effective, enforceable, and constitutional measures in place. Now, did they get there with what was proposed yesterday? Again, I've got a couple of concerns, and I talk about it with Sean Maloney of Buckeye Firearms Association. Take a look and a listen. Hey, Sean, it is so good talking with you today. Thanks so much for coming on the program.
Thanks for having me, Cam.
You bet. So Mike DeWine yesterday unveils his 17-point public safety plan, most of which I think is going to be completely unobjectionable to gun owners. I think there's a lot that gun owners can probably get behind. There's a lot of stuff that doesn't even address gun ownership or gun control at all. But there are two measures that a lot of folks are talking about today. One involving background checks, the other involving not a red flag law, but using Ohio's pink slip law, and we'll get into that. But let's start with the background check proposal. What exactly is Governor Mike DeWine proposing to do when it comes to background checks?
Well, I think they're trying to do a couple of things. There will be a Bloomberg ballot initiative that's being circulated right now, and there's no doubt in my mind it will have enough signatures to hit the ballot, and that's going to propose kind of a universal background check with some modifications to try to make it palatable, I think. So I think what the background check is doing, it's giving state leaders something to point to and say, we don't need this. And essentially, it's a voluntary background check system. And it's kind of their way to close the quote unquote gun show loophole. If you and I want to sell a gun to each other, I want to transfer a firearm to you. I know you. I know you're not under a disability or have good knowledge of that fact. Then of course I can legally transfer that firearm to you. But what if I don't know you and I met you on the street or we met online or whatever it is? So it gives it gives the seller the opportunity to require who you're going to transfer the firearm to apply for a voluntary background check. Eventually, they want to have their own portal to do this in, but right now it's going to the sheriff, and the problem with that is it's going to be far from instant. The sheriff is given 3 days to run the check. Of course, then you can have the 3 days delay from the ATF, at which point in time, under ATF rules, the firearm can automatically be transferred to you. But in the state of Ohio, they don't want to give you 3 days, give the ATF 3 days, and then it's your gun. They want to make it whenever the ATF answers, which could be never. So that's one of the problems. And another part of the problem is throughout the law, they're reducing the scienter. That's a legal term for the knowledge that I have to have that I'm committing a crime. It's recklessness right now, which simply states that I have to knowingly and with knowledge transfer that gun to somebody who I know or have reason to know shouldn't have that firearm. But when you reduce that to a negligence standard, really, I almost have no knowledge at all that I'm doing anything wrong or have a guilty mind, so to speak. And that's a big problem for a lot of people, because going down the road, I can know somebody, I hunt with that person, I have no reason to believe that they are under disability based on what I've seen, but I transfer a firearm to them. However long down the road, it was an improper transfer, and then all of a sudden I'm facing 3 years in jail, and I have no knowledge I did anything wrong. And that's a problem.
Well, it is, and Governor DeWine said repeatedly yesterday that, look, we're lowering the standard and we're raising the penalty. And those two things in combination concern me as well, because you're lowering that legal standard from recklessness down to negligence. But then the penalty is increasing from a possible 18 months in prison to 3 years in prison. And I'm with you. I would not have an issue with raising that penalty to 3 years as long as the standard was still recklessness. But to me, when you make it easier to put people in prison for a longer period of time, I know that Governor DeWine is a big champion of criminal justice reform, and I don't know how making it easier to put people in prison for a longer period of time actually, is a criminal justice reform measure.
Well, you're absolutely right. And one thing that really bothers me is they tout this as quote unquote voluntary. You can run a voluntary background check. And I had several heated discussions with Lieutenant Governor Houston, who's really was the craftsman behind a lot of this, or did a lot of the negotiations. And I told him, I said, it's far from being voluntary. As soon as you're telling me that I can be negligent without no knowledge of an improper transfer, if I don't run that background check, that I could do 3 years in jail. Well, that's not voluntary. You're forcing me to run a background check. And granted, none of us want to be selling a firearm to someone who's prohibited, and we're not going to do that. But now to make it a 3-year potential negligence crime in the criminal realm just really makes no sense whatsoever. Because again, I don't have to actually really know I'm doing anything wrong. Right. The fact that I did something wrong down the road, and I'm facing 3 years, and I think to tout this as a kind of a voluntary measure is kind of an affront to all of us, because let's face it, it's not voluntary. We're going to be forced to do these things. And I said, and under Ohio law, the biggest problem is you and I meet. You want to take your new rifle that I'm going to transfer to you out to Colorado and hunt elk. Well, and you're leaving in 7 days. Well, maybe you'll get the gun in 7 days because the sheriff has 3 days to run the check. And, oh, by the way, they haven't asked the sheriff's offices if they have time to even do this, if they have the personnel to even do this. And then ATF takes 3 days and they don't come back with an answer. Under current ATF law, then what would simply happen is that gun is yours. Because they didn't get to you, so you have that automatic provision of that. But under Ohio law, again, as I stated earlier, they're going to make you wait forever. You don't get you don't get that certificate that says that you can own the firearm until the ATF comes back. And sometimes the ATF never comes back. Sometimes it's 3 or 4 or 5 months. Mm-hmm. So, there's some problems with that. I understand what they're trying to do. Mm-hmm. But I think, and I had the argument, why reduce it from recklessness? I mean, if I run a background check and I know you're a prohibited person and I transfer, you're reckless. If I have reason to believe that you're a prohibited person based on any number of facts that just don't make me feel good, Well, then obviously if I make that transfer, then I kind of have a guilty mind or I have some question, and then certainly you can move forward. But to reduce it to a negligence standard, in my view, especially when you're dealing with criminal law, is crazy. You're reducing the scienter or my knowledge that I did something wrong to almost nothing. And I know judges, I spend my life in front of them. And 3-4 years from now, well, Mr. Maloney, you could have did something as easy as required this person to run a background check. Purely that's negligent. So, and 3 years later, I'll come out and kiss my wife and kids.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm with you. Listen, I understand and I actually appreciate, the approach that they're taking. I have those concerns, and I think they're legitimate concerns about increasing the penalties while lowering those legal standards for prosecution. Now, and we'll get back to this. I want to circle back around, but I do want to talk about what the governor and lieutenant governor talked about yesterday in terms of, again, not a red flag proposal, but using the existing Ohio civil commitment law, which is colloquially known as a pink slip, using that. And actually putting some teeth in that law. Again, it seemed like what the lieutenant governor and the governor both talked about yesterday is that this really isn't and Sean, you and I have talked about this before. I mean, I believe that red flag laws are a gun control solution to a mental health problem. It seems to me that what was proposed yesterday is actually a mental health solution to a mental health or even a substance abuse problem.
You're exactly right. And it took a while to get there. One of the first conversations I had with the governor, the lieutenant governor's staff, is I said, you need to wipe red flag from your vocabulary. That doesn't give warm and fuzzies to anybody in the sportsman's or firearms world. And right from the beginning, myself and several others said we already have the best law, I think, in the country in place to handle this. And that's the Ohio Revised Code pink slip law, so to speak. And I talked to several prosecutors that are friends of mine, and they said, hey, these all the tools you need. You don't need to try to take firearms away from the person. And universally, when I talk to psychiatrists and psychologists, when I talk to law enforcement and prosecutors, the worst thing you want to do is to go in and take a firearm, because you're only taking what you know is there. And a psychologist that I talked to said, it would be malpractice for me to leave a person in crisis just take their firearms and go. And they got the internet, they can make bombs, they can car keys, they can do anything. So when they looked at Ohio law, they realized, well, it's already there that if somebody is an obvious danger to themselves or others, then they can be simply quietly removed to a hospital for evaluation, where psychiatrists, doctors are making the determination whether this person is in need of mental health counseling or treatment and is in a crisis. And so with that available to them, they have 24 hours to see if this person's all right. Then if they make the determination that, hey, this person is in crisis and needs treatment and shouldn't be released or needs outpatient treatment or whatever the case may be, then at that point in time, the person is immediately brought before a probate court judge, where the psychiatrist, psychologist, attorneys are involved, their defense attorney, the prosecutor, and at least the judge is hearing evidence now that the person is either under a disability or not. And it's much better than before, because before somebody was just coming in and saying, I need a warrant to seize guns, and the person didn't have the opportunity to be heard and no due process until long after the fact. So the way this is designed is that the person is pink slipped or removed for medical evaluation. And then if there's something wrong, they're kept longer and they're brought immediately before a judge. And then the firearms aren't even really taken at that point. They can be transferred to a trusted family member. They could be sold. They could be put in storage someplace. So it's not an automatic seizure of the firearms. Certainly that could happen down the road. There's no doubt in my mind, but they went the extra mile to try to make sure that the person, they focused on the person rather than the firearms, which has been lacking for a long time. Now, they also had to add drug use or drug abuse and alcohol to the statute, simply because a lot of the complaints I heard from the prosecutors I spoke with in law enforcement was that we would pink slip somebody. They were in obvious crisis, they were having a problem, and then they would be released from the hospital because they weren't mentally ill. And at that point in time, if it was an active investigation, then the police could fill out a special form, hand it to the doctor, and the doctor can say what's wrong. And 9 times out of 10, it was drug abuse or alcohol. So they're going crazy because they're coming off their heroin, and certainly in the state of Ohio, opiate crisis has been terrible on us here.
Yeah.
And so based on that and whatever else could happen, if it was shown to be drug abuse or drug use or chronic alcoholism that was causing the problem, then there would be a treatment available for that. And plus, that's already a disability under the Ohio Revised Code. So that was already there. So you're really not adding anything new to the criminal statute. You're just kind of moving that from the criminal side under 2923 to the mental health side.
Okay. And this is, and I want to make clear, this is not, listen, if you have a drink or two after dinner, then, all of a sudden you get committed for alcoholism, or, if you've smoked a joint, all of a sudden you're getting, a pink slipped for drug abuse, right?
That's correct.
The standards are not, we're not talking about alcohol use or even drug use, although drug use is a prohibiting factor under state and federal law for gun ownership. We're talking about abuse here, and folks who have a substance abuse problem. And my first thought upon hearing this was, I don't know about this, but again, as you talk about Ohio, the second highest drug overdose death rate in the country in 2017. I don't think it got a whole lot better in 2018. No. And if this is something that, prosecutors, mental health professionals are saying, and law enforcement are saying that they need or would be useful, I'm willing to listen, because again, it's not specifically targeting gun owners. And, I got to say, Sean, as again, I'm not 100% on board with what I heard yesterday, but I will give Governor DeWine credit, Lieutenant Governor Houston credit. This was, I thought, the most thorough and thoughtful presentation, as well as, I think, an information gathering process. It was clear to me, listening to these public officials yesterday, that this wasn't just a matter of, okay, let's do something. That as Governor DeWine, the things that he originally proposed, almost 2 months ago, right, a lot of those did not make it into this final form not because he retreated. I mean, the governor did talk about, being able to pass something, but also it sounds to me like over this process of the last couple of months, you did have politicians who were willing to listen and to try to put laws on the books that are going to be constitutional, effective, and enforceable.
They went out of their way. In their first proposal, I can tell you they went so far out of the way to try to abide by the Constitution and due process that really became a danger to the police officers and others. The very beginning of this bill, when they were trying to put due process in it, if a police officer witnessed this person who they felt was in crisis, then what they had to do was they had to go petition the probate court to be able to remove that person by a hearing. And so what would happen is I would walk into a place as a police officer, someone who would be in obvious crisis, bad enough that I think that they need treatment. So I would go to a probate court and I would get a summons to hand to the person in crisis and says, you have to appear at a hearing in 3 days. And we're going to determine your competency to have firearms. And so they're giving the person allegedly a danger 3 days notice that, hey, you have a hearing in 3 days. And then at the end of the hearing, they would say, well, you need to turn your guns over to us. So you got to bring your guns back to us within 24 hours. Well, a person in crisis, that's given them another day to prepare to do whatever. And so there's a lot of things like that. And at that point in time, we pointed out to them that nowhere in this process is a psychiatrist or a psychologist involved. So what you're asking a probate judge to do is to throw a dart at the board and think, you know what, you seem like you could be a problem, or maybe you're not a problem. But more often than not, when you're dealing with an elected official, they're not letting anybody go.
Right. Yeah, they're going to err on the side of caution. Yeah, exactly. Well, exactly. Yeah, and the sad thing is, you don't see headlines about, this judge is just rubber stamping these red flag proposals. But darn well that there would be, screaming headlines if somebody that a judge said, nah, I don't think you're a danger. went out and did something. That's one of the things that I really like about this proposal is that it works within the existing mental health system. Again, as Governor DeWine said yesterday, this deals with the individual. It doesn't deal with, just the guns. Lieutenant Governor John Husted noted, he said that was one of the problems that he has with red flag bills is that they don't include mental health provisions, that it is all about simply removing the firearms from somebody rather than ensuring that person in crisis actually gets help. So given what you and I have talked about, again, I think that there's a lot to like. I think that there's a lot to support. There are some concerns that I still have. What do you think the chances are? Well, first of all, before we get to that question, let me backtrack for just a second, because the governor's proposal is just one proposal that we're going to be hearing. I mean, we've already heard lawmakers last week, two representatives introducing legislation dealing with quote unquote background checks. And it sounds like there are going to be other lawmakers putting forward their own plans that may complement or may contradict what Governor DeWine proposed yesterday. So are we going to see more bills dropping at the State House, you think?
There's a hearing today on House Bill 354 that's supported by the House, and it has some of the same provisions in them, a little different provisions on mental health and drugs, and so it's going to be kind of a wild session trying to determine what's best and what isn't best. Excuse me.
Yeah, no problem.
And one thing that I'm still very cautious on is when you're adding mental health or adding alcoholism and substance abuse to the provisions of mental health, are we creating another level or different reason to be considered mentally ill? Because granted, some mentally ill people have drug addictions or drug problems, some don't. And so that's what we have to be careful of, particularly in the House bill that I just talked about. It's like they just created another form of mental illness. And I said, I'm not a psychiatrist or psychologist. You need to talk to the mental health professionals, or this needs to be done a different way, because in a revised code, you have the definition for mental health, all the factors that you have to go in and prove. And then it says, or drug abuse or chronic alcoholism. Well, are you making drug abuse and chronic alcoholism also a mental illness and a reason to commit somebody? So there are problems like that I noticed that I've been kind of harping on now and arguing about for 3 or 4 days.
Okay.
But I know in the House they're coming around and they're understanding. Everybody wants to do the right thing, which is nice in my view. Houston and DeWine, they didn't start out that way, and it wasn't easy. But when you talk to them and argue with them and show them, quote unquote, the error of their ways, and look, a lot of those attorneys in the governor's office, they're not gun people. They don't understand that when you give somebody that you think is mentally ill 3 days to prepare to have their guns taken, that there's going to be problems. So they got to where it was going. But like you said, across the street in the House and Senate, there's bills dropping almost every day. There's probably 12 to 14 anti-gun bills, purely anti-gun bills that are over there from most of the normal Democrats that would drop these. And then there's that House bill. There'll be another Senate bill that's already going around. And I know Representative Schaefer has a bill out there. So there's a lot of bills, and they're going to have to go through them and try to form the perfect bill. And I'm not sure what that's going to be yet. But we have to be, we have to be ready, because when all this stuff starts happening, that's when things start getting crazy, and that's when they stop thinking about our rights.
Yeah, absolutely. And listen, it sounds like your phone is blowing up here, but I got one last question for you along those lines. Do you believe that the bills that we've seen, either the governor's proposals yesterday, the bills that have already dropped, and the bills that will be coming, all of these, it seems like, are sort of malleable objects, right? They're not yet fully formed. The governor's presented his legislative language, but there's still the opportunity to tweak this. Do you think that any of these bills, is it possible to get them? I won't even ask how likely it is, but do you think it's possible to get these bills in a form that gun owners and Second Amendment groups in Ohio would support?
I really think so, because especially when you're looking at current mental health law in Ohio. Somebody created this to work perfectly, to go hand in hand with the problems that are now with us, and certainly in this decade. And so those are already there. They're already built in with the due process rights. They've already been to the Supreme Court of Ohio a couple times, and they've been upheld. So it's a good starting point. And the work, the crisis of mental illness and harming other people in there, and they're going to spend a lot of money on making sure that people that are convicted of crimes and are under disability are put in the NICS system and the Ohio LEAD system. They're creating a portal where you have to enter the information once. There's 3 databases that this information needs to go in, including NICS and LEADS and another database. Well, the excuse has always been, we don't have the time to do that. And there's a lot of municipalities that are just 2 or 3 people operations, and they're dealing with convictions that put our people under disability. So what they want to do is create one entry portal where they enter the information, and then somebody else in Columbus or somewhere is going to put it all in to try to, instead of forcing them to do a job that for whatever reason they tend to not be able to do, just do it once, and we'll take care of that. There's some other bills, Cam, that I've seen that are creating disabilities in the state of Ohio that don't exist on the federal level, and it's kind of ridiculous for not thinking. Again, you have non-gun people and non-attorneys drafting all this stuff, so I'm sure that'll come out in a wash, and I know that we'll be watching that diligently to make sure that we don't have problems with that down the road. In fact, I have a meeting tomorrow with the Speaker of the House, and had the governor's people, those who were calling. So we'll see what else they're thinking about and what other questions they have.
All right. Well, listen, we'll let you get back to talking to the lawmakers. I appreciate you spending some time talking with us today. It sounds like we're not out of the woods yet, but no. The good news is that it sounds like at this point, some of these lawmakers are actually listening to gun owners, Second Amendment supporters, as well as those mental health professionals, law enforcement officers, and folks, across the spectrum. And I'm glad, because I think that I'm with you. I'm cautiously optimistic that there might be something that we can get done that would be effective, would be constitutional, and will be something that Second Amendment supporters could actually get behind. Sean, thank you again for everything you do there in Ohio. It is always good talking with you, sir, and look forward to doing this again very soon.
Call me anytime, Cam.
All right. Thank you, sir. Sean Maloney joins from Buckeye Firearms Association here on Bearing Arms Cam and Company. Meanwhile, in Oklahoma, a lawmaker has filed a lawsuit seeking to block that state's constitutional carry law from going into effect on November the 1st in just a few weeks. State Representative Jason Lowe, along with several gun control activists, filing the suit in state court yesterday, claiming that the constitutional carry bill, House Bill 2597, violates a provision in the Oklahoma State Constitution requiring legislation to be of a single subject matter. Representative Lowe says, look, this bill deals with not only constitutional carry, but it deals with, weapons bans on campus, with reciprocity, with self-defense. That's still a single subject. I mean, I hate to break it to the representative here, but I looked at the legislative language in House Bill 2597. I'm not an attorney, but it's pretty clear. The single subject of this legislation is firearms. That's the single subject. All dealing with firearms. It's not like they said, all right, in this bill with constitutional carry, we're also going to include subsidies for soy. Again, it's all having to deal with owning, carrying a firearm, and who is legally allowed to do so under the provisions of this law. So, again, not an attorney, but I got to say, I don't think this lawsuit has much of a chance. Representative Lowe, by the way, was also the guy who tried to put a ballot measure before voters in Oklahoma to reject constitutional carry. Earlier this year, he was collecting signatures. He had to get, I think, 50,000 signatures turned in by early September. If he had been able to do so, then the law would have been on hold until Election Day in November of 2020, when voters in Oklahoma would have had the chance to weigh in. He did not get the required number of signatures, and so that effort failed. Now he's out with, again, this last-ditch effort to try to block the constitutional carry law. I don't think he's going to be successful in doing so, but we'll continue to pay attention to this issue over the next few weeks. All right, let's get to our hero of the day, our good deed of the day. And, so I've got a couple of more emails here, good ideas for what to call this particular segment. The recidivism report was one. Let's see, I heard from Matt, who checked in. He says, how about calling it a matter of time? Or some variation on that. He says the meaning is twofold. It can mean it's just a matter of time until these individuals commit an egregious crime, or if they got more time or even served the amount of time they should have served for previous offenses, the community would be safer as a whole. I like that suggestion, Matt. Also, Shane writing in, he says, how about the criminal coddle of the day? I like that one, I think, just as much as I like the recidivism report. I'm a big fan of alliteration, the criminal coddle of the day. So, Shane, today, we're going to go with that one. We're going to call this the criminal coddle of the day. Although, I don't even know if this is necessarily a coddling here. Man charged in double homicide in Tennessee, not even supposed to be in the state of Tennessee. And yet, he has been there repeatedly. As a matter of fact, over the past couple of months, Jermaine Agee, who's been charged with 2 counts of murder for the death of 38-year-old Myra Garcia and her son, 13-year-old Jaden Taylor, 13 years old, had a court order forbidding him from leaving the state of Alabama. But this is the second time since July that Agee has been found in Nashville, despite that court order. So first time he broke that court order, apparently nothing happened. Agee has a lengthy criminal history, including an attempted murder charge in 2010. He pleaded that down to aggravated assault. He went to prison, obviously not for long. Also has theft and robbery convictions. According to WSMV in Nashville, after being released on probation, Alabama's Bureau of Pardons and Parole shows that in May, Agee was arrested for loitering and for being in possession of drug paraphernalia, which was a parole violation. Metro Nashville court records show that Agee was identified on July 26th as having a fugitive from justice warrant out of Alabama. August the 3rd, Alabama authorities actually went to Tennessee. They picked Agee up. They took him back to Alabama. A spokesman for Alabama's Division of Pardons and Parole says the judge then put Agee on probation once again with orders not to leave the state again. And on Monday, Nashville police said Agee killed his ex-girlfriend and her son, as well as critically injuring her teenage daughter. Now, WSMV also points out that Garcia had obtained an order of protection against Agee last week after police say he punched her in the face and swore out a domestic violence warrant. There was no probation violation out of Alabama that was issued. Spokesman for the Division of Pardons and Parole says it's only alerted to convictions from out of state. So, again, what happens when a violent felon violates his probation, leaves the state when he's been ordered not to? The answer apparently is nothing happens. They'll come and they'll pick him up, they'll transport him back to Alabama, and then they'll tell him not to do it again. So at what point does the criminal justice system get serious with somebody like Mr. Agee before he is accused of committing heinous crimes like killing his ex-girlfriend, her 13-year-old son, and trying to kill her daughter as well? Is there any point when the criminal justice system can step up and say, okay, this guy violated his probation, guess what? Now you're going back to prison? Or does that only happen after a suspect like this commits a heinous crime that ends up leading the nightly news? Our hero of the day, or armed citizen story of the day, from Akron, Ohio, where a robbery apparently went poorly for the would-be armed robber, because as it turns out, his intended victim had a firearm himself. Yeah, according to Akron police, this went down on a Sunday night. 22-year-old Jonte Alexander is a guy who police believe was trying to commit the armed robbery, who was shot and killed by his intended victim, shot multiple times after apparently using a gun to rob another man, according to Ohio.com. That other man, unidentified, we only know that he's 27 years old, had non-life-threatening gun wounds to an arm and torso. He told police that he was walking down the street when Alexander brandished a gun, demanded cash. The guy told police that the attempted robber became distracted, and that was when he drew his own firearm and shot Alexander, who then returned fire. Residents in the area heard the gunshots, called 911. Police said they found Alexander on a nearby sidewalk with multiple gunshot wounds. He was taken to a local hospital along with the intended victim in this case. Happened about 10:30 Sunday night in a residential area. Again, police still investigating, but right now this looks like a case of self-defense. We'll keep you apprised of any updates as they become available. And our good deed of the day. How about this? That's footage from an officer's dash cam in Belton, South Carolina, where one of their officers helped a baby who was choking. Police Chief Robert Young Jr. says it happened Sunday afternoon. Police got a call about a welfare check, basically an infant choking at a home. The first officer on scene, Corporal Daryl Foster, found the child had choked on medicine that had been given to her by her mom. Corporal Foster said Dad was just in a state of shock. Mom was panicking. He turned the baby over, started patting the baby on the back in an effort to dislodge the medicine, open the child's airways. Corporal Foster said, we arrived on scene. Father actually had the child in his hands, was trying to stick his fingers down. So I was given the impression that she was choking. The good news is, after a couple of pats on the back, the baby did start breathing on its own again. Corporal Foster said it was just lodged in there. The medicine was. The child just started screaming and crying. And he said that was a positive thing to actually hear that from the child, because it meant she was able to get air. Said the entire rescue lasted maybe a minute. He said his own children went through his mind at the same time. He said all I could think about was my 2-year-old little girl and how I did what I needed to do, what we needed to do to fix that situation. So again, in the right place at the right time, willing and able to do the right thing. Corporal Daryl Foster there in Belton, South Carolina. We thank you, sir, for your good deed. That is going to do it for this edition of Bearing Arms Cam and Company. We thank you for being a part of the program as always. You want to get in touch with me, a couple of ways you could do so. Email is cam.edwards@bearingarms.com, or you can find me online at Cam Edwards on Twitter. I'm on Instagram and a couple of other places. I'm on Facebook, but I always forget about Facebook. So Twitter's the best place to find me. Email works as well. You can subscribe to the program as a podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, townhall.com podcasts. You can also subscribe to Town Hall Media at YouTube to get the latest Bearing Arms Cam and Company each and every day. Thank you so much for being a part of the program. Have a great rest of your Tuesday. We'll see you back here soon with another edition of Bearing Arms Cam and Company.